Okay, and I really appreciated earlier, Nathan, you saying that you'd only put norms in the title because that was the name of the conference. So I'm going to do one better. So the title of this talk is Parenting Norms, and as you'll see, it's only sort of about parenting defined literally. And it's not really about norms, which is to say it's going to be about cultural differences in behavioral regularities. But I'm not going to wade into whether these necessarily reflect norms or not. So I'm going to start, let's see if I can do this. I'm going to start by telling you a little bit, a tangential anecdote. So about 3 months ago, my 6-year-old daughter my husband was trying to get my 6-year-old daughter to brush her teeth and get ready for bed. My 6-year-old daughter was trying to find ways to delay going to bed. And she started asking my husband why it was that in some bird species, the males and the females were different colors, but in other birds like penguins, the males and the females looked pretty similar. And so my husband is not an ornithologist, he's an economist. And so he did what any good parent would do, and he pulled up Google Scholar on his phone, and he found that there was an interesting paper in Nature a few years back looking at perching birds and showing that in species where the male birds do some of the child rearing, the gender differences in color tend to be smaller. And we thought this was pretty interesting, so we do a fair amount of work on gender norms related to things like women's labor force participation, and I also do a fair amount of work on early childhood. And what's interesting is that economists spend a lot of time, and Nathan talked about some of it this morning, spend a lot of time thinking about the cultural factors that shape women's entry into the labor market and women's labor force participation. And all economists at the back of their minds when they study these topics have a sort of Becker-style model of division of labor within the household. So the idea that men tend to specialize in the labor market because women are specializing in the child rearing. But we rarely look directly at the division of labor and the gender division of labor in terms of the parenting and the child rearing. Now, parenting is arguably, child rearing is one of the most important things that human societies do, raising, additional humans to carry on their genetic heritage, but we tend not to focus on that. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So I'm going to come at this talk slightly through the side door by first saying, why do we even care about the outcomes that we're going to be studying? So this is a talk about how families invest in their young children. And we're interested in this because we are increasingly aware of evidence from developmental science, the study of child development, that early childhood investments are really critical to long-run developmental trajectories. So if you miss out on the window in which you can receive adequate nutrition and stimulation when you're a young child, it has ramifications throughout your life course in terms of your human capital, your income, etc. And so many of you have probably read stories about the sort of egregious cases of this from Romanian orphanages. There's also evidence on the positive side, intervention. So Sally Grantham McGregor has a famous intervention in Jamaica showing that having childcare workers do home visits to educate parents about the importance of nutrition and child stimulation has really dramatic effects on not just short-term developmental outcomes, but also long-term outcomes like income in adulthood. And so motivated by this evidence, so the World Bank and the United Nations have been encouraging the governments of low and middle income countries to really expand the amount of programming that's directed at early childhood investments. And so there are two ways of doing this. So one is by expanding access to pre-primary education if that education is of high enough quality to actually have a positive impact. And the other way is through programs that provide training and support for parents. So many Latin American countries in particular have recently rolled out variants on this home visiting model that try to encourage parents, and I say parents, but I usually mean mothers, to do more stimulation of their young children. And so you can think of this as nutrition, but equally importantly, things like reading to children, infant-directed speech, things that engage and stimulate young children and get them speaking, talking to their parents, building their vocabularies at a young age. So these policies are increasingly well evaluated in terms of their impact on children, but very rarely do people studying these types of interventions consider the fact that there are other members of the household, again, particularly mothers, who might be impacted by such policies? And so what's interesting is that, like many things in the child development space, these policies are motivated by a somewhat sort of weird-centric or OECD-centric notion of how society is organized. So this is a figure taken from the work of the anthropologist David Lancy, who sort of it compares the mainstream in the United States to the mainstream in many other parts of the world, particularly in traditional societies, and points out that the United States and many rich countries are what he calls a neontocracy. So the point is, children are the most important citizens. And that's not the way many other societies have been organized. And so it has not been the norm in many societies to organize everyone's life and everyone's day around what the child needs, when it needs stimulation, when it needs book reading. This is a relatively recent innovation even in Western society. And in fact, what you see, there's increasingly work, so Matthew Jukes has done work, Sharon Wolf has done work, looking at what parents value in many low and middle income country settings. And what's interesting is that parents' top priority is often not raising brilliant, curious, demanding, noisy children who get worked up if they don't get their favorite Berenstein Bears story before bed. It's equal, you want your children to be successful and prepared for school, but it's equally important that your children be obedient and respectful and well-behaved and demonstrate good behaviors that reflect well on you and on your community. So a lot of the existing literature on early childhood development interventions sort of minimizes the notion that there is a tension between the goals of promoting child development and other goals that communities might have for their children. Okay, so I want to talk briefly about the types of data I'm going to be looking at today. So this is sort of 1.5, maybe 2 papers, neither of which is written yet. And so the first part, I'm going to talk a bit about some cross-country comparisons, and I'm going to use data from UNICEF's multiple indicator cluster surveys, the MICS. And this is the best data available on the amount of early childhood stimulation that kids receive. So I'm going to give you more information about the types of things that are being measured, but just to sort of give you a sense, the darker colors are indicating countries where the MICS finds that parents are doing more active stimulation. And so you can see that there's so this is data from 75 different countries. There's now 3 different rounds of the MICS. And you can see that there's a lot of variation. So there are some, so the lightest colors, so the least amount of stimulation tends to be in West Africa and also in Pakistan, Yemen, so a few different places, but some patterns. When we look at the darkest colors, it isn't one region of the world that is doing the most stimulation. So the top 5 countries include Belarus and Ukraine, also includes Qatar, includes St. Lucia. So a lot of places in the world, it's not that there's one place that's doing the most stimulation. Now, I'm mostly not going to be talking about the level of stimulation. I'm going to be talking about who does it. And so we know this from the MICS. The MICS includes a series of questions called the family care indicators. And the family care indicators ask about a 72-hour recall period, and for every child in the household, parents are asked to report on whether anyone did 6 different activities with the child. So singing songs, telling stories to the child, naming objects or counting or sort of verbal training like that, reading books or looking at books together, other types of physical play, and then taking the kids anywhere. And they ask this about all kids who are 3 and 4 years old. And so they ask whether these behaviors were done by the mother, by the father, or by any other adults in the household. And so what I want to talk about is a little bit about the division of this parenting labor that we see around the world. So I've put the fraction of each type of stimulation done by the mother, the father, and other adults into this ternary plot. So I just want to explain what this is showing. So these are 3 numbers that sum to 1. So as you increase in this direction, you're increasing the share of stimulation that's done by mom. So in this corner, you've got mom doing all the stimulation. As you increase in this direction, that's a higher share of stimulation being done by the father. So over here, this would be if the father did all the stimulation, which, as you can see, never happens. And as you go up, you're increasing the share of stimulation that's done by other adults in the household. And so you can see a couple of things that jump out at this. So the first is that there is variation in how much fathers do, but fathers are not doing a very large share of the parenting in any of the societies in the mix on average. So you can see, always between about 30% of the stimulation and about 10% or a little bit below. So the title of the talk is Who Does the Parenting? But it could equally well be who does the mothering, or as we'll see, parenting may not even be the right word, because an awful lot of it is getting done by people who aren't parents. And so what I've done is I've broken this down so the orange dots here are sub-Saharan Africa, the blue dots are Latin America and the Caribbean, and then the other countries, which are about the same number of countries in the mixed data, are in gray. And what you can see is that in the sub-Saharan African countries, it really does sort of, I hate to say it takes a village, but I'm going to say that's what we seem to see, that there's a much higher fraction of stimulation that's being done by other family members. In Latin American countries, the tendency is that mom is doing a very high fraction of the stimulation, so more than 60 or 50% here. And then we see other countries are sort of a mix, but not as starkly, other regions are not as starkly divided as those regions are. So, and I can show you, and this is really reflecting something about differences across countries, so I could show you the same plot, it would just be busier with this broken out by urban versus rural areas. And what you see is that rural and urban within a country are very similar. So this isn't necessarily something that's about income, or that's about the mode of organization of production. This is really something that's a regularity at the country level in terms of who is engaging in this sort of stimulating behavior. Okay, so I then was interested in what factors shape these tendencies. And so, this is just sort of summarizing what I've already said. As Nathan was telling us this morning, there are a number of different papers looking at historical factors, cultural factors that shape the gender division of labor, particularly whether women enter the labor force. So I'm going to look at two that I happen to have ready at hand. So I'm going to look at the use of the plow, and I'm also going to look at whether what the proportion of a country's citizens whose native language is a gender language, so encodes grammatical gender, because this is something I've been looking at in another paper, so I happen to have all the data. And what's interesting is you see that the historical factors that shape women's labor force participation don't shape men's involvement in parenting. So if anything, when I don't put in region fixed effects, the relationship goes in the other direction. So in areas where there was traditional use of the plow, in areas where a larger proportion of individuals speak a gender native language, you see a higher role of male involvement in parenting. So you see that both in terms of the share of total stimulation and the share that is done by parents. So if anything, these factors that are keeping women in the home are not changing the allocation of who does the parenting in a way such that mom is particularly specializing in raising the children. Then we can look for a minute at the levels. And so this is comparing the amount of stimulation by the father to the mother and the amount of stimulation by other adults to the mother. And so what you see here is that, when we looked at the proportions, you saw that other relatives do a lot more in sub-Saharan Africa. That isn't actually because they're doing more overall. What is the case is that in sub-Saharan Africa, we see the norm that parents are doing relatively little stimulation. And now the other thing that's interesting is that if you think, who reads the child a story, who is putting the child to bed, there should be some substitution between mothers and fathers, because only one of you needs to be making dinner or putting the child to bed. We don't see that at all. Okay, so in places where the mom does more stimulation, those are actually exactly the same places where the dad does more stimulation. So this is not about the division of labor and who is responsible for doing this sort of childcare. This seems to be much more driven by norms or regularities about how important it is that you engage with your children in this way. We don't see that when we look at others. It's not that they're moving together, it's just a cloud. Mothers are doing, we see a lot of variation in how much mothers do, and then basically others are doing about the same level regardless of how much mothers are doing. So in no case do we see what really looks like a substitution from parents to other people. Okay, so there's little evidence of this sort of specialization, and it really does look like, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, there's this norm of very little early childhood stimulation as measured by the best international measure that we have. And so then the question is, what is likely, is this just the truth, or is there something missing from this data? And so I'm going to spend my last few minutes of this talk talking about what is missing in terms of parental stimulation. And so these are 3 different photographs of people doing parenting or childcare of young children in sub-Saharan Africa. So this is from a book that's about 30 years old at this point, based on a study of childcare among Kisi-speaking people in Western Kenya. This is a picture that's taken from the place where the data I'm going to use in the rest of the talk come from. This is a Luo-speaking area of Western Kenya. It's adjacent to the Kisi-speaking area. And then this is a photo that a friend took in Malawi more recently when I told her about this paper. So these are 3 different examples of childcare in sub-Saharan Africa relatively recently. And what you see is that the person who's doing the childcare is not mom, but the big sister. And this is something that David Lancy talks about in his book, that in many societies, particularly African societies, older siblings, but particularly older sisters, play a huge role in taking care of children. And this is interesting from a policy perspective, from a developmental perspective, because this role is essentially ignored in all discussions of parenting, childcare, interventions, even descriptive work. So in our data, I'm going to show you data from a study that we're doing. It's the data from the baseline for a cluster randomized trial. It's data from 2,000 households in small rural villages in the Luo-speaking area in Western Kenya. We've got about 2,500 kids. And so one of the things we did is that we we used the FCI measure that I told you about. One of our co-authors on that project is is one of the developers of the FCI, and we worked with her to expand it to better capture a slightly broader range of activities, but also to capture things that were being done by younger children within the household, so sisters and brothers at a variety of ages. And so what you can see when you do this is that older sisters are the people doing the most stimulation in these households. Mothers are next, and then brothers are doing the most. And so when you focus in the internationally comparable measure that exists on mom, dad, and others, you're actually ignoring 2 of the top 3 people who engage in early childhood stimulation. Now, there is a reason that this is done. There are a variety of reasons. You can think about the sort of political economy. One is that you don't want to really promote saddling young 7-year-old children with lots of childcare responsibilities when they should be going to school. And there is a view that the stimulation that's done by young children may not be as developmentally valuable as the stimulation that's done by adults. Nevertheless, from a descriptive perspective, when you only focus on stimulation by adults, you're missing a lot of what is going on. So older sisters do a lot of the stimulation, more stimulation than anyone else in the household. And again, fathers are not doing very much. Okay, so then I want to think a little bit, and this is not, I'm sure all the fathers in the room do lots of early childhood stimulation. This is not a statement about fathers in general, but about norms and why we might need to change them. Okay, so I want to look a little bit more closely at what the impact is of this stimulation that's being done by older sisters. Because in part there's this view that stimulation by kids is likely to not be as valuable as stimulation by parents. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on the 550 households Emerge is the name of the study, in the data set that have exactly 1 older sister or older brother. So you've got a data set, it's 2,500 kids aged 3 to 6, and then we're going to look at households that have, in addition to the 1 or 2 kids in that age range, who have exactly 1 older child. And you might worry that fertility is endogenous. We can look across a whole range of outcomes. Kids that have an older sister versus an older brother look similar on a whole range of observables. And so we're going to treat the sibling gender as plausibly exogenous. And so I'm basically going to estimate a treatment effect of having a sister versus the counterfactual of having a brother, assuming that the sex of the older child is as good as random. Okay, and so I'm going to use this data set that allows me to look at different types of activities in this sample of 550 households. So I just want to think about just think a little bit about a conceptual framework, probably very briefly because I don't think I have that much time, but you can basically think about everybody in the household is making a trade-off. So mom, I'm going to focus on a household that has one parent, because you'll see in this data set that is fine. Parents are trading off time between labor doing home production and investments that they make in their younger child. And the older child is trading off effort in school and investments that they're making in their younger sibling. And they may be less effective than investments that the parents are making. Okay, and so we have these this is a concave production function for household production, and then you have human capital productions functions that we also assume are concave. And so everybody's optimizing here. And so the important thing to note in this framework is that if sisters are going to be better than brothers at stimulating their young kids, then parents should respond. When you have an older child who is a girl, you should be investing less in your young child if you perceive the value of your young child's labor effort. And then the other thing that we can think about is what if there's sort of a budget constraint story. So I've written this down for simplicity as though the mom is only dividing time between her own production time and investing in the younger kid. You could also extend this to allow the mom to also invest in the older kid, and that allows you to think through whether there's a budget constraint story. And it gets a little bit more complicated theoretically, but if you think about it with some minimal regularity assumptions, if you have a budget constraint story, so if the mechanism here is that parents don't care about the older sibling, so they have more time to invest in the young kid, then you should see that any effects are only there for young male children, and you should see that coming through in a change in the parents' allocation in response to having an older sister. So the first thing I'm going to show you is that when we look at this amount of stimulation that kids are getting, we can see that these are just sort of the regression I described. So I'm just regressing on a treatment for that is whether your older sibling is a sister. You get a lot more stimulation if your older sibling is a sister. And so you get a mean of about 5 out of 12 stimulating activities if your older sibling is a brother, and you experience more stimulating activities, about 0.6 more stimulating activities if your older sibling is a sister. And this is coming through what your older sister is doing, okay? So you see that, as expected, if your older sibling is a sister and not a brother, you get less stimulation by older brothers, and you get more stimulation by older sisters. 2 full activities out of 12 activities, more stimulation. And then the other thing is that there's no parental budget constraint story at work here. So parents are not changing the amount of time that they spend stimulating their young children in response to having an older sister, a babysitter who's trapped in the home and can do a bunch of this work for them. So this is all coming from the direct effect of the older sister and what she's doing, and not through the parents reallocating their time. So that's sort of interesting, right? Because whatever you think the cause is of sisters being better at this than brothers, it's interesting that parents are not responding. So there are a few different reasons that might be the case. So it could be the case that parents don't actually perceive the inputs, their inputs, and what the siblings do in stimulation as substitutes. It may be that they don't actually perceive the relationship between these sorts of stimulating activities and child development. So they don't realize the investments that they are or are not making in the human capital production function. Or maybe these stimulating activities are not something that they're actively choosing at all, right? So you're singing to your kid because you're trying to get your kid to not cry while they're taking a bath. This isn't about an active choice of how much stimulation, potentially. And so this raises the question of whether these activities even matter for child development. And so what I'm going to show you is, I could do this in an IV framework, but I'm just going to show you evidence that they do in the reduced form impact of having an older sister on child development. So I could spend a lot of time talking about the measures here, but basically we have a vocabulary index that we measure vocabulary both in mother tongue and also in English. We also have a fine motor index that's adapted from the Malawi Developmental Assessment Tool. And on both of these, we see that having an older sister is associated with just over a 0.1 standard deviation increase in development. And we can average those two together to get a little bit more power. Sisters have a relatively large impact on child development in these young children. And so it's clearly the case that the things that sisters are doing are translating into outcomes that matter for young children. Okay, so why have I talked about this in this conference? Well, I've tried to show you that there are some behavioral regularities to who is actively engaging in parenting. And so one thing I've shown you is that many fathers in different contexts are doing relatively little. This is an area where there are now a lot of interventions that are trying to change this. So I was just in Kenya. I was meeting with researchers from the African Population and Health Research Council who've been doing work to try to incentivize dads to go to clinic visits. There are a variety of other, so there's a study in Liberia that looks at trying to promote fathers' involvement by having male community leaders talk about their involvement in child rearing. So I think that this is an area where we don't yet know for sure what changes the norms, but people are actively working on it. The other thing is that there is a regularity that siblings are doing a lot of child rearing that is essentially ignored in the existing literature on child development, both from a policy perspective and a research perspective. And so hopefully today I've shown you some evidence that what these siblings are doing really matters and is something that we should be thinking seriously about. Thank you. No, so that's certainly true. In terms of, so, I mean, I think that's, I think within, so let me first say that there is variation in fertility, but you saw a lot of variation in these things like Latin America versus other regions. Fertility, total fertility is quite low in most of the world except for sub-Saharan Africa. So I think that that could certainly be part of the story of why we see relatively low levels of stimulation in sub-Saharan Africa, but not necessarily in other regions where total fertility is relatively similar across like, North Africa versus Latin America, and yet we see different patterns. Was there a second part to your question? No, okay, thank you.
Can you talk a little bit about the sort of cultural nature of the definition of stimulation? And it just from looking at the way that it's measured, it looks very verbal, and to kind of privilege verbal stimulation. Can you talk about that? It sounds like you're saying this is like the best available data, the best available measure that we have of this, but from how I interpreted that is that you see other ways to think about stimulation than maybe the measures that you have. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think from a developmental perspective, verbal skills are one of the earliest ways that we are able to measure overall, also fine motor skills. And there are things like physical play, taking the kids places, but verbal skills are like vocabulary skills are something that can be measured in relatively young children, and they tend to be a good kind of leading indicator of broader higher level cognitive development in young children. And so I think part of the reason that those things are privileged is that and also there were things like counting objects, which are related to the development of mathematical skills. That's the earliest, like finding the language to describe things is one of the earliest measurable developmental indicators of a bunch of things related to mental development. And so I think I think that that's largely a reflection of the priorities within the child development community and the consensus on what's the best thing to measure. Yes. Yeah, I mean, so I think that there are a variety of reasons that you can't separate. So it could be straight copying. It could be that girls sort of perceive that it's good to learn to be a good mother, or there could be other ways that social norms surround, like, so these are families where there is no other sibling in that age range, right? And so when there is no other sibling, it may be that the norm is copy mom or copy dad, but it's clear that the brothers are actually doing a lot of the childcare in those households. And so whatever the source of the regularity, it's clear that it has some consequences. Mm. Sure. Yep. Yep. No, I mean, so we have done that exercise of asking parents what they think are important skills. And I mean, you're exactly right. And this is part of why there's this tension between, and this isn't just about economists, this is actually less economists than it is about the people in public health who are studying child development, who are very focused on these measures of whether you're building the sorts, whether you're advancing according to measures that have been validated in rich countries. And so I think that's exactly right. Now, the pushback to that is that these aren't, it's not some very remote hunter-gatherer tribe. These are people who are going to, these kids are going to go into an environment where they all go to secondary school and they're competing in the modern economy for jobs. And so actually, these measures are good predictors of many of the skills that they're going to need. And parents are very aware of that when it gets to the age when their kids are in school. So by the time you get a kid who's 6 or 8, that what they tell you they want for their kids is that they do well in school. But what they don't yet understand necessarily is the link between talking to your children and not trying to get them not to talk to you when they're 2 or 3, and how they're going to be able to do on the reading test when they get to 3rd or 4th grade. And this is part of why there's this tension between meeting the culture where it is and also figuring out how to help parents to understand what's needed for their children to succeed. Yeah, but
and a cash bar, so I'll be quick. And maybe my question will resemble Joe's, so if it's too similar, just let me know, and that's okay, we'll waive it. So I was wondering, what makes those big sisters that good at being big sisters, at culturing their younger sisters or brothers? Is it like a cultural, is it like their learning cultural ability that made them that good, or is it a genetic skill that they just inherited and that makes them so good? Since what I'm thinking about is it appears that this norm of children comes first is actually putting mothers, specifically mothers, last. So what I'm wondering about is what caused what? So is it the social norms of the gender roles of what motherhood should look like that encourage this norm of children comes first, or is it this norm of children comes first that is nurturing the other norm of gender roles and motherhood roles?
Well, I mean, I think that children comes first is specifically articulated in Lancey's work as a characteristic of industrialized societies, whereas this norm that there are gender roles, and it is, girls, mothers and sisters and girls who do most of the child rearing. There's variation across societies, but it is not something that is a characteristic of industrialized society. So it seems clear that it can't be, the causality can't be running from neontocracy to the gender role regarding the division of parenting.